know, you've had yourself a very successful morning here. Killed yourself a really nice white-tailed doe, but now the work begins. First of all, before we start this field dressing, or you start the field dress your deer, leave on your hunter orange. Don't take it off. It makes you identifiable, so do that. Number two is, be sure that you've met the requirements as far as your state tagging is concerned. Now in my state, it says what I have to do, I have to have my permit signed, and it's signed. And then of course on the back of that, there's the information on the kill. Here, what I'm gonna have to do is I cross out here or punch out, cut it out, whatever. I cancel the female, I cancel November, and I cancel the 14th. Now that cancels this permit and makes it the tag. This permit and tag combination has to stay with the animal. If I'm with it, I can carry it. If I leave the animal, I have to leave this tag or permit with the animal. But be sure and check your state regulations so you're not violating the law. The next thing is be sure and wear rubber gloves. Now, one thing about rubber gloves, they sure keep your hands good and clean. You don't have the mess when you get done cleaning the deer. But also, it's just a good precaution on account of disease. You know, we have the chronic wasting disease here in the state in the Panhandle, and we've had occasional show-ups in other parts of the state. It's just a good precaution. You know, we don't have any evidence that humans can even get chronic wasting disease, but still, there's just a lot we don't know about it, so it's just a good precaution. Wear rubber gloves. You know, the first thing when you get to field dressing this deer we're going to have to do is break into the body cavity. Now, there are a couple of ways you can do this, and you make up your own mind at how you want to do it. But you can start right at the brisket with your cut into that cavity. If you're going to do that, be sure that the head end of the deer is uphill a little bit, because then the pressure of the intestines won't be working against you. Or you can do like we're going to do here. We're going to go into the anus here, into the vent, and we're going to start from the back end of this deer. Now, in order to do that, you'd like to have the head down just a little bit, because then that pressure is the other way for you. Well, let's get started. First thing we're going to do is cut around the urinary opening here. We're going to go in here, make a cut, and just through the skin. We're going to go down here and around the vent here. We'll just make this cut, get around the vent. We're going to come back up here and do the same thing on this side. Cut around, a little difficult, but be sure when you're doing this, try to keep your knife under the skin. Now I'll tell you why. Because if you're cutting from above, you're going to get hair in that meat. And one thing you don't want when you're cleaning that meat up and butchering and cutting your own up or whatever you do, you don't need a lot of hair in that meat. But now we've got that done. Now, what we've got to do is trim this urinary tract a little bit right here, get it started in there. The one thing you want to be very cautious of here is you don't want to cut a hole in the bladder. And the bladder is right up here close. So when you start this cut around here, be sure and keep your knife pointed out like this and keep it out of that urinary tract and go in there pretty deep when you make that cut. Cut around that so it's free. Be sure and keep your knife pointed out. You understand what I mean? Pointed out this way into the bone, because then you can't be poking holes in anything. Saw around that and cut it plenty free. Don't worry about that going in there too far, but keep the blade pointed out into the bone. You can feel that as you're cutting. Now, the urinary tract, you want to be awful cautious, like I say, because that bladder is right here, right in this opening. But get that cut free. See how I'm pulling on that? And then when you run your knife in here, be sure that you're staying on the outside of the pelvis. Run your knife blade out. Keep the blade into the bone. And that way you're not going to poke a hole in the intestines. See what I'm doing there? I'm keeping that knife right out against the side of the pelvis. Try not to cut toward yourself. Now, we've probably got that free enough that it's going to pull in for us when we decide to go. Now, the next thing we want to do here is we want to pull that out there, and we're going to tie this off. We're going to take a string and tie that off. Take a little piece of nylon like this, and I tie a slip knot in it, because this is pretty slick stuff to handle. Pull that in there and be sure you got the vent up through there. And when you get that, then pull this up tight, that slip knot. When you get that pulled in there tight, then I just tie another little knot in here to make sure that that slip knot stayed. Now I've got that tied off so that when we pull the entrails inside, no manure or urine can run out of there. Now if this were a buck deer, you'd start the same way. You'd tie off the vent here, but this cut's going to be a little different. We're going to start in down here, and we're going to cut up to the testicles. And once we get up there, then we're going to trim those out, cut around them like this, and you're going to notice that the urinary tract then We broke some there. You can see that came up through there. But you notice this year and just kind of went out on the hair. It really didn't get on the meat. But if that should happen, be sure and clean that off. Wipe it off, wash it off. But the other thing is be sure and clean that knife off and get it good and disinfected. But the urinary tract goes right back down to the groin area. See how it does? Goes right back down through the groin area. Be careful when you make this cut, because you notice here I've cut into the meat here. But cut that clear back to the groin, and then when we pull the intestines in, when we make this other cut, that'll pull in with the anus. At this stage in the game, it might be good to remind you that every once in a while you want to disinfect that blade. You know, we've entered that deer in kind of an unsightly area, and I laid the knife on the ground. I carry handy wipes with me, generally an alcohol base or a Lysol. You can even take water and mix it with some Clorox. A little tablespoon of Clorox in a gallon of water is all you need. Keep that knife cleaned off. Now we return to this vent area here, and we're going to make a cut right up here. Now remember I told you keep your knife underneath, and the reason you're going to do that is because you want to keep that hair out of that meat, and you can do that by simply keeping your blade under. Now we're just going to cut through the skin. You can skin around this, the udder, if you want to. I'm not going to in this case. I'm going to cut right through it. And sometimes a doe deer will still be carrying milk, and you'll see that. And then I just walk that right forward so you don't poke holes in the intestines. But we'll do some trimming here and cut this out around here, because right here is where we're going to make our entry into this chest cavity, into this abdominal cavity. Right here is the groin area. We're going to make a cut there, and right here, and right here, and there's going to be a lot of pressure right here. Now here's where you don't want to cut into the intestines, and this is where I'm going to switch blades. I'm going to go from this blade to what they call a gutting blade, and you can see how that's made. It's got a little round thing on there. That keeps you from poking a hole in the intestines. You can stick that up under there and just kind of saw your way right up through there and not have to worry about poking a hole in the intestine. See what I'm talking about? And we're going to take this clear up to the brisket here. Just like that. And now we haven't poked a hole in the intestines at all, or the stomach or anything. All right? There you are. Now we've come to this point here with this kind of a blade. If you don't have this kind of a blade, lay your two fingers in here like this and put your cutting blade in between there so the point isn't exposed, and you can just start clear back here and just walk that right up so that you don't poke any holes in the intestines, and that'll work for you. But these little blades are handy. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on up here, and I'm going to open this deer up to here. Then I'm going to switch blades again because I need to go back to my cutting blade. And I'm going to kind of clean this brisket off here. I'm just going to make some cuts here just to kind of clean the fat and get me down to the brisket. Hear that bone? You can hear it. I'm right down to it. And now what I'm going to do, here's another thing you might want to carry. You can cut this brisket with a knife. It's kind of a chore, but in this little knife, it also has a saw, little saw blade. And all I have to do, and it's rounded here so it won't poke hole in the guts, all I have to do is just start up through that brisket like this. You want to cut that far enough forward that those front legs kind of fall out to the side, and you've got plenty of opportunity then to get into the chest cavity. And in order to do that, you've got to get right clear up front of the brisket. You'll tell when you get there because it'll fall right open. This needs to be cut pretty much clear up here because we're wanting to open this up. So be sure to open this chest cavity up, right up under his throat there, or her throat. See how that opens up then? Okay, now the next thing I want to draw your attention to here is the diaphragm. The diaphragm lays in between the heart and the lung area. The liver's right behind it and all the intestines. It's what separates, it's what lets that deer breathe. And this needs to be cut out of there because that's what attaches the front end. So you want to start with your knife here and keep real close to the rib cage and just trim that. And you've got to go clear down. You need to roll that deer over and cut that clear down to the backbone. Same on this side then. You're not going to be able to see that too good, but cut that diaphragm clear around. Get that cut free. And then when you get that cut free, the next thing you need to do, and this will be pretty much disconnect the intestines, and that is cut the trachea here. Now this here has been shot up here in the throat, but that trachea is right here, Just be sure you get that cut off right there. Can you see that? And that's tough. It's tough to cut. So, but saw it off, and you can pull that right on back. See there? And you might have to trim a little here. It's hooked on. But the other thing I want to tell you is on this trachea, if you're going to hang this deer and let it age or anything, be sure and cut this deer on up, skin that out, and take that trachea out. That's one place the meat will spoil. One thing that's helpful here is a stick to prop this open, and just kind of helps you to hold that so you can see in there what you're doing. Now I'm going to hook onto this. We got a little blood here, a little trauma, but I'm going to pull like this, and there's still some place here where that diaphragm hasn't cut free, and so I'm going to have to cut that, see? I'll lift up on this side. Can you see where it's kind of hooked there, the fat and stuff, and get that cut. Now you want to be careful when you get to this point, because in this meat, inside here are the little back straps, what they call. Right here, see them? You don't want to cut those up too much because they're pretty good eating. So I just pull this free and cut the fat and pull those intestines out on the other side. This deer's fat, good deer. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go down the other end here, and we're going to free up that intestinal tract and pull that back inside the deer now. Now you remember when we started, we cut the vent and the urinary tract here free, and we tied that string on, and now we're just going to pull that inside, see there? And then we're just going to roll the intestines out, and we're done with that deer. It's a nice deer. For all practical purposes, this deer is already field dressed. We've got the entrails out and everything. And now next thing I'm going to do is, of course, we got some trauma in there. We got some blood. I'm going to lift this deer up here and get her head uphill so that drains out. It don't take much. Starting to drain out right now. We'll probably take a paper towel too and just kind of dry it out a little bit. Now you can either do that, or you can roll this deer over with his chest cavity out if the ground is good and clean, if you're not going to get a bunch of bad stuff in the meat. If you got a 40-degree day, you can leave the hide on. It'll probably cool soon enough. If you don't, get that skin off and get it protected. Get the meat protected so it doesn't get dirty. But don't leave it lay on the ground, because that meat on the ground is insulated and it'll sour quick. If the heart and liver are something you want to save, here's a little clue. The heart is sometimes kind of hard to find, but actually it's right in between the lungs, and it's in a little placenta. Just poke a hole in that, like I'm doing with my knife here, and that heart will just slip right out of there. See there? Boy, this deer's got a nice heart. Now trim that off. You can be careful with that, or you don't have to be too much. It's just, that's what you're going to wind up with right there. And I always put that in a bag. I sometimes put it in a cloth bag, simply because the cloth will breathe a little bit and makes it cool a little quicker, but I'm going to bag that. Now, if you want to save the liver, it lays right there. Just be sure that what you do when you cut the liver out of that, be sure not to cut into the gall, because the gall is one of the little bile, or the bile rather, not the gall. The bile is right there on the head end of that liver, and you don't want that in that meat. So cut out around that a little bit. I don't know whether you can see that very good, but you can see how the liver lays there, and you'll know when you pick it out of there, you can tell how to cut it. Do not eat the meat if the organs smell bad, if they exhibit greenish discharge, have blood clots, or are discolored. One thing I might address here too, the lymph nodes in a deer are similar to our body. They're in the fatty tissue areas, so when you're cleaning the deer, of course the lymph nodes will come out some with the intestines, but there are going to be lymph nodes left in that deer. Now here are a couple of lymph nodes that came from the deer's throat area, and they're generally enlarged in the kind of the fatty tissue. So when you clean your deer, be sure that you check that fatty area and get all those lymph nodes out of there. These are pretty good sized. Some of those in the tissue here in the ham area here will be smaller, but if you find one that's any bigger than this, if it's twice, 3 times that size, then I think I would be suspect of the meat of that animal. I don't know that I would want to eat it. I'd have it checked for sure. Getting back to the chronic wasting disease issue, just remember this. Don't cut into or consume the brain, spinal cord, spleen, or lymph nodes. And remember this, removal of all the fat from the meat will remove the lymph nodes also. When you're done with this deer and it's cut up and ready for the fridge, you're going to have the carcass. Be sure you dispose that carcass in whatever manner your state requires. Well, it's time to get this old girl home and get her cut up for the freezer. Just remember this, one of the important things is to keep that meat cool. You can pack this cavity with snow, you can stop and get some ice, get it iced down, but keep the meat cool. It'll make better table fare.